So Raven Idol. We'll start with the Druid cards. Raven Idol. Kind of a weird card. It's a 1-cost, discover a minion or discover a spell. So this is one of the Druid's sort of themes is flexibility. We see, with the sort of shape-shifting modes of lots of the different cards. They choose cards like Keeper of the Grove, like Ancient of Lore. And this is about as sort of modular a thing as you're going to get. That, it's like, okay, right now I need to try and find maybe something on curve. Right now I need to try and find something that can react to what my opponent's doing. It's 1 mana. So this is super potentially flexible card that I think has a lot of interesting implications for allowing decks to do a variety of things outside of just the very set number of options you have in a single deck normally. My inclination is that it likely won't really see all that much constructed play, simply because usually when you're building a deck, you want it to do a certain thing rather than necessarily just have a lot of flexibility. And in particular, discover a minion. There's so many minions that this could hit. Versus like discover spell, it's like, I think that the flexibility of being able to find a certain Druid spell, having a choice of a range of them at a given time in the game is likely useful. So I imagine that mode is going to be the more commonly used one if someone is playing with this card. But the fact that it can sort of fill out your curve with the minion side potentially is kind of interesting. My guess is that this really won't be a particularly powerful constructed card, but it seems like it's a solid arena card potentially, just because filling out your curve or finding things that are appropriate for the particular moment is worth the additional sort of tax on the spell in arena. Mounted Raptor. So this is a pretty powerful card. It is a 3/2 that Death Rattle summons a random 1-cost minion. If we compare this, say, to Harvest Golem, that's probably the most apt comparison for Mounted Raptor. I've actually seen a lot of people suggesting that Mounted Raptor is like super strong. It's like a new piloted shredder or whatever. But I do think there's already a comparable card in the game in Harvest Golem, and I think that generally the 1-cost minion that you're going to get from Mounted Raptor on average is worse than Damaged Golem. So the fact that this is a beast, or that you want the 3/2 upfront body, I think is actually versus a 2/3 from Harvest Golem is really the place where you'd be making that sort of decision. Would you rather have a 3/2 beast, or would you rather have a 2/3 mech? Because that's where the real differentiation of these cards feels like it is. So my inclination to this card is, potentially a card that could see play, but is not nearly the sort of powerhouse that people seem to be suggesting in their comparisons to Piloted Shredder. I do think that this is possibly a card that could find a home in Beast synergy-based Druid decks, because that's something that I think does need help, and maybe we'll see a bit more of that because Mounted Raptor, it certainly is a strong minion, but I don't think it's going to be changing the face of the metagame in itself, except for the fact that it may encourage these sort of new deck builds. Jungle Moonkin. This is, again, a beast, which is weird from a WoW lore perspective because Moonkin could not be scare beasted. I should know, I played a hunter, and he could never scare beast the chicken. But as a 4/4 for 4, not super powerful, but the fact that its ability is actually really high impact. Both players have spell damage +2. If you have a way to make strong use of spell damage, this is an extremely powerful effect. This is obviously super powerful with swipe. It's super powerful in particular with effects that are leveraging the spell damage more than just like an individual thing. Like, for instance, this is not particularly good with like Wrath. It's fine, but it's not that much better than just like, Ogre Magi, where you're getting marginal, additional value, but potentially, risking your opponent also being able to use the value from the spell damage. So here, I think that if you're using this with say, Swipe, with, say, Starfall, which are cards that, because they are multi-target, gain additional benefit from spell damage compared to the average card, this could be pretty strong. Or if somehow, you can do the classic Moonkin spamming Moonfire, which was really what Moonkin did in WoW, in my experience at least. Because if you cast multiple Moonfires in a turn, because you're leveraging the cost of that. You're leveraging the fact that this is, a really cheap effect. For instance, similar with Living Roots. Maybe this is a powerful card because you're able to do 4 damage with Living Roots for 1 mana. But generally speaking, I think that this is a card that is probably not going to find its way into all that many decks. Its stats aren't great, and it is a a really big potential drawback if you do also play against an opponent who can leverage the spell damage as well. Moving on to Hunter. First we'll start with Dart Trap. Dart Trap, when an opposing hero power is used, deal 5 damage to a random enemy. This is a weird trap. I like the fact that it's a trap that's punishing something different than any of the other Hunter traps. The other Hunter traps were generally all about like punishing your opponent for attacking. This is punishing them for playing a new type of effect. And this is actually a quite powerful trap effect. If you do get your Dart Trap off, it's either likely to kill one of your opponent's creatures or do 5 damage to them, both of which is pretty powerful. The problem is that the kind of deck that wants either of those isn't necessarily the same deck. Like, if this were deal 5 damage to a random enemy minion, or deal 5 damage to your opponent, either of those would be a stronger effect here. And I think that it's unlikely that like a Face Hunter style deck would want this because it's not reliable in terms of being able to actually deal damage to your opponent because, hey, it requires a hero power, and B, it can potentially just hit a minion rather than something like Explosive Trap, which even though it's not going to do anything near as much damage as this, it is able to at least be guaranteed to damage your opponent, which is the goal. So I like this card conceptually, but I'm hard-pressed to figure out a place where it would likely be played. Desert Camel, and this is a pretty interesting card. So it's a 2/4 beast for 3, which in itself is actually pretty attractive. The fact that Desert Camel is a beast that is very likely to survive anything that is played on turn 3. It has higher health than most minions have attack at 2 or 3 mana. So it's a very likely beast to be able to stick around for something like Houndmaster. So I think that this is a very attractive card for a mid-range style of Hunter deck, even before you look at its ability. Even before you're paying attention to the battle cry on this, just 2/4 beast for 3 has like some appeal just because of its ability to enable things like Houndmaster. So the battle cry, put a 1-cost minion from each deck onto the battlefield, is interesting because there are a lot of games in which this is just not a drawback. Like you'll get a 1-cost minion and your opponent will get a 1-cost minion in a lot of situations, but if your opponent has no 1-cost minions in their deck, say they're playing something like Control Warrior or Patron Warrior, almost any warrior deck really. Say they're playing something like Freeze Mage, say they're playing something like Midrange Druid. This is just a 2/4 minion that comes with most likely something like a Web Spinner. And that's like a really high value minion. So I like the fact that this is a card that its power level is pretty contingent on the sort of matchup that you're in, and there's ways to leverage it either way. Like the fact that it's just a beast that's like to stay in play, and it's a very high value beast when you play it in a situation when you can mitigate the drawback, or against a deck where you can mitigate a drawback. It is, however, potentially a risky card to play if you're playing a, say, like aggressive deck, like Face Hunter, like Seeker Paladin. It's like if your opponent gets a free Seeker Keeper and you don't already have a board presence, like that can be a disaster. So I'll be interested to see what sort of impact this has on the way people build their decks and the sort of Hunter decks that do get built. I do think this is a card that will pretty much certainly see constructed play because it's certainly very powerful. Then Explorer's Hat. So this is kind of a cool card. I'm kind of sad that it's a Hunter card because this feels like a card that would go great in different decks, like for different classes. Like for instance, this would be a great Priest card, I feel like, because buffing your minions is much more valuable for Priest, and Priest already has a number of significant minion buffs like Powered Shield, like Valen's Chosen, that could very easily go in a deck with like Lightbane, Deathbane, and Dragonkin Sorcerer. Like this is a card that if you have enough stuff like this, and in particular this card exactly because it can trigger multiple different minions when you play a spell targeting this triggers. So that I think is pretty cool. But I don't really see this as being something that Hunter is necessarily looking for. There aren't really that many places where I'm trying to just like incrementally buff my minions in Hunter. It could be interesting in like Lock and Load. If you're playing a deck that has Lock and Load, this is a card that can trigger multiple you can get some value out of, get it back to your hand, trigger Lock and Load later. It's kind of cool, but I don't really see a place that this is going to find a home, at least among existing constructed decks, and I don't really see it being in Hunter as particularly inspiring a new Hunter type of strategy. Forgotten Torch, and this is the 3 mana, deal 3 damage, shuffling Roaring Torch into your deck that deals 6 damage. Also costs 3 mana. This is kind of neat. I like the fact that you're gaining some sort of future efficiency, basically adding additional threat to your, or total burn damage to your deck. I think that adding additional cards to your deck is something that is a pretty unique element of Hearthstone in the way that certain matchups play out, and it has very different value depending on the kind of matchup you're playing. Spell damage like this, or spells that just do damage like this, I think are less compelling as additional cards to add to your deck compared to something like a real threat. When you're playing a game that is likely to go to fatigue, you want things that can cause repeatable damage. Like it's one of the reasons that that Paladin hero power is so effective against Control Warrior, because you have this infinite ability to generate threat, and having the ability to continue to both be less likely to fatigue, as well as to be able to have more threats your opponent has to deal with, is a very real thing in control matchups. But this sort of card is not really doing that. This is a sort of card that it is adding one amount of set damage to your deck. It does incrementally reduce your likelihood of fatiguing. Like if you are playing a controlling style of deck and you find yourself in positions where you are threatened with fatigue against a deck like Control Warrior, this is a card that will help reset your fatigue, which is interesting. But I don't know that that's enough of an appeal to play this over something which may be more efficient at interacting. Because obviously, anytime you put a card into your deck, you have to be playing it instead of a different card. So I'm not sure what this would replace in, say, a control mage style of deck. And I'm also curious how the exact mechanic works. Like, say if you're in fatigue, say you're 4 cards into fatigue and you cast this, do you reset your fatigue to 0? That's actually a question that I don't know the answer to. But it does actually make the dynamic of having just one of this card in your deck, if that's how it does work, very, very different. Because if this completely resets your fatigue and you can play a fatigue game where you will suddenly not be in fatigue anymore, I think that's actually extremely powerful in some matchups and would significantly change the way that I think about this card. We have Ethereal Conjurer. 5 cost 6/3 battle cry, discover a spell. So that is kind of weird. We've seen some 5 cost 6/3s in our day that none of which have ultimately been effective. Like Hemet, I don't even know the name of the card. The Paladin mech that gets Divine Shield whenever you play another mech. That card is all these cards are kind of neat and potentially powerful, but their body is just so weak. 3 health on a 5 cost minion is extremely weak, and Battlecry Discover Spell, again, this is kind of like what we were talking about with Roaring Torch. The ability to add additional stuff to your deck has some value in some matchups, and this actually adds it directly to your hand, which is more powerful clearly than adding it to your deck, because you immediately gain the value out of it. It's actually value there, but it's the body that you're getting in the first place just feels pretty weak. Compare this to obviously it's the impact of a spell that you're going to discover from Conjurer is going to be higher than a spare part, but compare this to Toshli. Toshli costs 1 more mana, gives you 2 spare parts, Battle Cry and on Death Rattle, and just has actually really, really good stats at 5/7 for 6, whereas this is going to die to a Knife Juggler or a Piloted Shredder or anything down the curve. So this is, I feel like, a pretty weak card overall, just because what it is providing in terms of an actual body in play is relatively low impact. Last in Mage, we have Animated Armor. Now this is an interesting card. Your hero can only take 1 damage at a time. The problem with this card is it's effectively just, in most situations, or at least in minion-based situations, this is effectively taunt. But that's actually, it is taunt that if your opponent doesn't actually have minion-based damage, is pretty tough for them to deal with. If you play this against, say, a Freeze Mage opponent who has just like Alex Straza'd you, they have to kill this before they can actually, you know, damage you, which is obviously way better than if this were a taunt. It's kind of like both. This is very similar to both in that your opponent has to get rid of it before they can kill you. It's not as good against multiple small things as both, but you know, no one really played both to begin with. So, but this is, I think, you know, potentially reasonably effective against like face hunter style decks, where, you know, they're just like trying to bring you out with their hero power and kill command, and even incrementally reducing that damage by a bit is pretty valuable. That said, its stats are pretty bad, and it's going to, I think, be difficult to justify putting this into a lot of different decks. But I do like the concept of it. I think that the idea of cards that do this sort of thing, that change the way that the game plays out in a certain way, is pretty cool. I'm just not convinced that this is going to find a home over something like Healbot, you know, which is going to be doing the same kind of thing in a lot of situations. All right, then we will go to Paladin, Sacred Trial. Well, this is actually a very powerful effect. As to whether this is better than existing Paladin secrets and may find a home in Mysterious Challenger decks, it's unclear. But like if you know your opponent has some guys and you play Mysterious Challenger, and this is one of the possible things that can come up, it can really screw up your opponent's plans. So I think that the threat of Sacred Trial out of Mysterious Challenger decks is a real thing. But I don't know that it's really a card that will end up replacing any of the cards that is more guaranteed to have an impact on the game. I think that if this were in any other class than Paladin, it almost certainly wouldn't see play, because, you know, the fact that it is something that you can fetch as one of many things from Mysterious Challenger is one of the reasons that this is potentially a compelling card. But it is definitely going to throw a wrench in a lot of people's plans, if this is even like something that they have to keep in mind when they're playing the game. The big problem is that your opponent has to allow you effectively to trigger Sacred Trial. It's actually extremely easy to play around, because as long as you have anything that they can attack their minions into, they can just kind of naturally play around it and go down to 2 minions. But I imagine this is going to be a card that gets someone real good, and then they'll never stop playing around it again. All right, Keeper of Uldaman. So obviously its stats are not particularly strong. It's a 4-cost 3/4, but the fact that its battle cry is set a minion's attack and health to 3, which is cool thematically, because it's like I will set your set your stats to just enough that I can take you down and not die myself. That's cool. That said, I like the fact that it is both a potentially offensive and defensively oriented card. Like, you can use this with your hero power, with Silverhand recruits you get from Muster for Battle, in order to turn them into real threats. And you can also use it to mitigate your opponent's threats. If you're able to, shrink your opponent's Doctor Boom, or their Mysterious Challenger, or their Tyrion, or whatever, to make it so that you can interact with it more favorably, along with just being able to actually get some value out of your own, effectively token creatures. So I don't really know that it's going to find a home, because it is relatively situational, and there's a lot of competition. You're fighting against things like Piloted Shredder, like Murloc Knight at the 4-cost. So it is a very, very contentious mana cost slot. I mean, Blessing of Kings, Truce of a Champion, Consecration, like these are all really really powerful things. But be able to buff, say, an Argent Squire or an Anoyotron or things like that is one of the things that makes this card potentially pretty attractive. So I think this is a card that could easily be a lot better than it looks at first glance. So I would certainly not dismiss it yet, and would not be surprised to see it find a home. All right, Anything Can Happen. This is a really weird card. I do think the fact that this set has a number of cards that are potentially able to encourage people to build new types of decks, like Murloc Paladin, that's cool. But this costs 10 mana. And 10 is, in case you weren't aware, a lot of mana. That's the most you can have. So you'd have to have like 7 really powerful Murlocs for this to really be all that effective a spell. And I don't know that there are 7 powerful Murlocs you can reasonably have. I mean, like, maybe this is some sort of like end game finisher in some Murloc Knight deck. Because, you don't even necessarily have to have that many Murlocs in your deck because Murloc Knight can generate them. So maybe your deck is only powerful Murlocs, like Murloc Knights and War Leaders and an Old Murkai and whatever else, rather than necessarily being a card that goes into a dedicated Murloc deck. You do need to have had 7 die that game in order to take advantage of it, but the biggest problem with this is less the deck building constraints and more just the mana cost. 10 means that it is only going to come up in games that are going to enormous attrition, and those are games where Paladin, and especially Paladin decks that already have Murloc Knight, is typically going to already be very powerful. So this feels like it's more of just like a wacky cool card, rather than a card that is legitimately going to be particularly effective in constructed play. The Priest, Museum Curator, a 2-cost Battlecry Discover a Death Rattle card. It's a 1/2. So Priest is a class that in many cases suffers from not really necessarily having great things to do on the second turn in many cases. We've seen this quite a bit over the years, basically, that Priest has existed, that the threaten, heal your opponent is often one of your common plays. It's a lot less likely to happen with the modern Dragon Priest style decks because they are much more proactive. But having a card like this, like Discover Death Rattle card, there's a lot of very good Death Rattle cards. And be able to find like a Dark Cultist, be able to find a Sylvanas, be able to find even like a Harvest Golem or whatever, are all pretty powerful effects. I'm not sure that there's going to be a deck that is like looking for a 2-drop so badly though, and like cares that much about the 1/2 that it is going to be playing Museum Curator over something else basically. It is nice that it's something that you can play that will contest like 2/1s on that your opponent might play on turn 1. That also guarantees you're getting value out of it because it's giving you this Battlecry effect. And this is also a pretty important thing. Like you could play in that spot like something like a Loot Hoarder or a Novice Engineer that draw you cards instead. But as I was saying earlier, with respect to the Roaring Torch and such, being able to add cards to your deck is a very, very important and relevant thing as opposed to drawing cards. Like Priest, in particular, controlling Priest style of decks are actually very likely in a lot of matchups to go to fatigue. So adding a card to your hand from outside the game in those games is way more powerful than drawing a card because it doesn't bring you closer to fatigue while also generating additional resources. And if the 1/2 body, even if it doesn't matter at all or matters very, very little, it's still not counting against the resources you have to win the game in those matchups. And frankly, a lot of Death Rattle cards are just very good. So I think that this is a very reasonable card that is like a early minion that can contest the board, not against a lot of stuff, but basically against 2/1 minions. But that still is able to provide you with the ability to find something that can be useful in a matchup against more controlling decks. So one of the things that I also think, just talk about the Discover mechanic in general, I think that it's really interesting that it is basically enabling a kind of random element to games that is you're able to craft the strategy around. And I actually really like cards like, say, Web Spinner, cards like Unstable Portal, because they are cards that allow you to sort of try to build a game plan around these things which are not normally a part of your deck. And Museum Curator can create those same sort of strategic plans where it's like, okay, I got a Piloted Sky Golem off of my Museum Curator, so now like I can try to play in such a way that I'm able to pressure my opponent with this. Or if I got a Explosive Sheep, and the fact that you get to discover a card, meaning you choose one from 3 options, allows you to not only craft a game plan around what you do get, but decide which of those things makes the most sense for the particular game that you're playing right now. So anyway, I do think this is an interesting card, and I'm certainly going to be experimenting with it because I do think that it is a potentially valuable minion for the early game against some aggressive decks that can still be relevant in terms of the way your game plays out against control. Entomb. This is one of the cards that I'm probably most excited about in the new expansion, and it's for a number of reasons that I've talked about already. The fact that this is a card which, A, is just a great removal spell that avoids Death Rattle effects or Divine Shield effects, which is extremely strong to begin with in a lot of ways. We've seen Recycle in Druid. It didn't really see much play, but Recycle, there's a couple of problems with it that it doesn't necessarily mesh with what Druid is trying to do. You don't really have late game focused Druid control decks that want to, are focused on the value of removing your thing and like getting rid of Death Rattle effects, whatever. It already also has Keeper of the Grove to be able to silence those Death Rattle effects, so it's not nearly as relevant. It also, if you were playing a long control game with Recycle, your opponent can just redraw that card. So, it's not something that actually works with a strategy that is potentially going to go to Fatigue. Entomb is actually both in a class that really wants this kind of thing. One of the strongest cards against Priest, period, against any Priest deck like that is playing it all to the board, has always been Sylvanas. I've always been super frustrated anytime I'm playing a Priest deck and my opponent plays Sylvanas, and it's like, well, I have no clean way to kill this. Basically, to sacrifice my entire board or death it and then try and kill my own thing as efficiently as possible. But Entomb not only mitigates the Death Rattle effect of Sylvanas because it shuffles the card into your deck rather than destroying it, so there's no Death Rattle effect. But it also gives you that resource potentially later in the game. Right now, a lot of Control Priest decks actually struggle against Control Warrior, and there's a couple of reasons for this. One, the Control Warrior decks have the ability to play really effective board control games, eliminate all of your individual threats, and then just use Justicar Trueheart, tank up a million times, and win the game. Because they can just play Fatigue better than you can. But with Entomb, you're doing a couple of things. One, you have an incredibly efficient answer to any of their minions, including Sylvanas, which has historically been a big problem. But it also is giving you more cards in your deck and higher threat density, more big things your opponent has to remove. So if you Entomb your opponent's Sylvanas, not only do they lose their Sylvanas and not get the Death Rattle effect, but in a game that is likely to go to Fatigue, they then later on have to deal with your Sylvanas. So this card in any Control Priest deck that is potentially likely to go to Fatigue against a Warrior deck is extremely powerful. But it's kind of like Mind Control in that way, but the fact that Entomb costs 6 means it's a totally reasonable card to actually use to remove things in other matchups. Mind Control is basically, this is my trump card against other control decks, but it's horrible everywhere else. But Entomb, you can Entomb a Savannah Highmane, and that's great because you've removed your opponent's Savannah Highmane from play. They don't get their Death Rattle. Fantastic. I just hit my mic and boom. All right, Excavated Evil. One thing that I have talked about feeling like there's not enough of in Hearthstone are ways to come back when you're behind. And things like Hellfire, I think, are actually kind of outclassed by the minions that exist right now. You can Hellfire a Secret Paladin deck on turn 4, and they can end up still having a ton of stuff in play because they have, their Redemption and Piloted Shredder and Minibot. None of those die, and you just kind of get wrecked. But with Excavated Evil, this is, I think, still a powerful card. It's like Hellfire in that it's maybe not quite efficient enough at what it does to be a great response when you're really far behind. But the fact that it shuffles into your opponent's deck, this is an interesting thing because in a matchup against aggressive decks, that's actually a detriment to them most of the time. If you Excavated Evil, and you shuffle your Excavated Evil into your Face Hunter opponent's deck, it's horrible for them. They draw Excavated Evil instead of a real card, and it's basically just they skip their draw. So it's the fact that it kind of looks like it's a drawback. It's now your opponent can control when they cast it next time. In a lot of cases, just won't be. So that's interesting to me that the fact that you're basically cursing your opponent's deck, making it worse. In many cases, when you are going to be using this effect, is very powerful. So this is a card I'm definitely going to experiment with. I do think that it is more appealing than a lot of other sort of options here, but it may just be too weak for how much it costs and how much it does against mid-range style of decks, because 3 damage for 5 mana is just not that much. But we'll see. All right, Tomb Pillager. So all of the rogue cards in this set are minions. And I've seen some people complain about that, oh, rogue is a spell-based class, so you want to have more spells to go with your combo stuff. But A, Tomb Pillager is great with combo stuff because its Death Rattle gives you a coin. And B, I actually think that it's pretty important that the cards that classes get try to open up new strategies rather than just cementing the strategies that already exist. It's much easier, also from like a design and development perspective, easier. It's much more effective to create cards that create new strategies or encourage new strategies than replace cards in other strategies without just purely power creeping. Like, okay, well, are we going to see a card that invalidates, okay, this is better than Piloted Shredder, this is better than Shielded Minibot. It's like, those are obviously really hard cards to outclass, and you don't want to just be doing that because otherwise the power level of your game just keeps increasing, and that's in itself kind of a bad thing. But with cards like this, they encourage a different kind of deck for rogues. Like, I actually think that Tomb Pillager might encourage players to have more sort of like big minion late game style rogue decks. Like, if your opponent kills your Tomb Pillager, you get a coin. That's like actually very powerful. And normally, like having a minion like this that is relatively vulnerable, like it's a 5/4 for 4 mana, so it's going to die down to a lot of things. But if that means that you get to play your Dr. Boom or whatever, your Anubarak a turn earlier because you have the coin, that's actually very, very strong. So I think that this is a card that may help enable more sort of minion-based and like ramp-style minion-based rogue decks. I don't know that we're going to see, this guy paired with like, Cut Purse or whatever, because that card I think is probably just too bad. But this, because it is a Death Rattle effect, even though it is vulnerable, given its stats and cost, you still get that powerful effect out of it. So you can ramp to your big minion after your opponent does kill your Pillager. Pit Snake. So Pit Snake, basically a pretty basic card, pretty simple card. It's a 2/1 beast for 1. Whenever it damages a minion, kill it. So this is the Emperor Cobra, except more efficient combination of stats. It is more vulnerable. Obviously the fact that it's 1 health means that lots of things very easily kill it. I don't know really where this might have a home. There's no real beast synergies in Rogue, and would you play this over, say, Clockwork Gnome, Leper Gnome, whatever? It's like, yeah, this is a nice minion because it can kill up the curve in the situations where that comes up. Your opponent can't just clear it with a larger minion, but I don't know. It's hard for me to find a place that I want to play this card. I imagine that, like, if you're playing an aggressive style of rogue deck, something like South Sea Deckhand or Leper Gnome or whatever is much more likely to find a home. But this is in itself a totally reasonable card. I would have been. I'm curious to see why this is really a rogue card. This feels like this could have just been a druid card, and been in like the beast druid style of decks. Could have been interesting, but anyway, as it stands, probably not going to see a ton of play in my mind. I think that there are just, for anything that your rogue deck is trying to do, probably better options. Unless what you're trying to do is just kill big minions with your minions, and then hey, Pit Snake's for you. So Unearthed Raptor. I think it's a pretty important card for Rogue, because it's just a solid body. One of the things that Rogue has lacked in itself is minions that have reasonable bodies that actually contest the board well. You basically see Rogue decks playing all like SI agents and Earthring Farseers. Nothing that has great stats by itself. And obviously, Rogues already had the opportunity, if they wanted, to play cards like Spider Tank, but Spider Tank is not as powerful clearly as Unearthed Raptor unless you're getting some benefit out of the mech synergies. Unearthed Raptor is interesting. You can play, you obviously want to be playing cheap Death Rattle minions that you can combine it with, or potentially playing this later on for powerful Death Rattle minions. Like, if you have a Sylvanas in play and you just copy the Sylvanas' Death Rattle, then trade off the Sylvanas, you get an additional trigger of that. I'm curious how Unearthed Raptor actually works with a Nubarak. If you copy a Nubarak's Death Rattle trigger and it dies, does the Raptor return to your hand? Or do you get a copy of a Nubarak in your hand? I'm just curious how that's actually coded. We'll find that out. Don't worry, we'll find that out. But I imagine that if you want to play this in your deck, you're going to want to have cheap Death Rattle minions like Loot Hoarders or Leper Gnomes or whatever, so you can gain those effects as well. So, but yeah, I do think this is a card that will very likely see play alongside the Tomb Pillager in those sort of more minion focused rogue decks that I hope that we'll be able to see with these new cards from this expansion. Next in Shaman, we have Tunnel Trog. So Tunnel Trog. This is basically the Shaman Mana Worm. Whenever you overload, gain +1 attack per locked mana crystal. It's a 1/3 for 1. One of the problems that Shaman decks have often had is that overload is a mechanic that punishes you pretty heavily in terms of spending your resources now and being locked for later to gain something immediately. And if you're only trading like 1-for-1, or you're only trading like you're not like really profitably getting ahead with your overload spells, you'll just fall behind as you get overloaded basically, and you can't keep up. But this is kind of like additional zombie chow for a sort of mid-range overload style shaman deck, and it's really powerful. This card, it's a zombie chow with no drawback in many games, and pairs extremely well with a lot of the early overload cards that you would not necessarily want to play before, but like if you play Tunnel Trog on 1, Totem Golem on 2, you have a 2/3 and a 3/4, super early in the game. That's very, very powerful. Similarly, you can make cards like Feral Spirits or Lightning Storm, which kind of have gotten outclassed as the game has progressed, and cards have often, more powerful cards have come into existence that don't line up, or rather that those cards don't line up very well against. But if you are buffing a Tunnel Trog when you're overloading for 2, really powerful. So I am excited to try building shaman decks, like mid-range style shaman decks, using this card. I think it's super good. And I have high hopes for Shaman to find success in the hands of someone other than Pimping Ho. Rumbling Elemental. After you play a Battlecry minion, deal 2 damage to a random enemy, 2/6 for 4 mana. I don't know that this is really enough to want me to build a Battlecry deck around it, but this definitely encourages you specifically to play cheap Battlecry minions. Like you want to play, things like, Gnomish or Novice Inventor and not a Gnomish Inventor, just like things that are giving you some sort of value and potentially cycling you through to more stuff. I think this card is like fine. Like a 2/6 for 4, clearly stats that make you want to keep it in play for longer. Maybe we'll be able to have enough sort of things that encourage you to play a Battlecry deck like this and crowd favorites. And Brand Bronzebeard, who we'll get to eventually, that like all of that comes together. There are some powerful Shaman Battlecry cards regardless. We have Fire Elemental and such that you'll naturally want to play in that kind of deck. So it'll be interesting to see. It's possible that this is a powerful effect. I mean, if you are naturally already playing a lot of strong Battlecry effects, then maybe this is something that you'll pair them with. But I don't know that 2 damage to a random enemy at this cost, at this like point in the game, because you're basically not going to get a trigger on this until turn 5. And how powerful is dealing 2 damage to a random enemy on turn 5? It's pretty good, but I'm not sure how good. Just given how the game state can develop. But if you're able to trigger this multiple times, if you're playing like Inventor into Inventor or whatever, it's like, okay, Inventor to Engineer, something like that, or with Fire Elemental, those are all pretty powerful things. So I imagine this triggers after you have gotten the Battlecry effects. You won't have information about like, okay, I want to Fire Elemental your 5/5 because it's going to die to your Rumbling Elemental. You won't have that to inform your targeting decisions. But it's a pretty powerful effect. I'll definitely try exploring how to make it work, because it is tough to kill. 6 health for 4 mana is very tough to kill. So it'll be interesting to see if this is able to sort of build an archetype around it. And last, and perhaps least, every Fin is awesome. Give your minions +2/+2, cost 1 less for each Murloc you control. So obviously, if you're able to swarm the board with Murlocs and play this for super cheap, it's extremely powerful. As to whether that's a reasonable strategy, it's not entirely clear. The fact that this isn't a card that only goes in a Murloc deck. This is a card that's at its best if you have Murlocs. Like, this is kind of like a Bloodlust. It is, more expensive than Bloodlust. Clearly, it costs 7 rather than 5. But it's a permanent effect, rather than for the turn effect, and it boosts the health of your minions, which is very strong if you're actually like building a board and trading. So this is clearly a card that is at its most effective in a deck that's generating a lot of stuff on the board. Things like Haunted Creeper and Nerubian Egg, and frankly the fact that Shaman has the hero power that just makes these totems, things that make your totems into real threats, are quite valuable. So I'm definitely going to try building a Murloc Shaman deck with this. There's a number of incentives to play it. There's Neptulon, there's the Sylphin Spiritwalker, none of which I think are as good as Murloc Knight in Paladin. So maybe Paladin's the true Murloc class, but this is an extremely powerful effect, especially if you're able to reduce it significantly for having a number of Murlocs in play. So certainly worth trying out, and we'll see if it is in fact awesome. Warlock with Dark Peddler. So Battlecry, discover a 1-cost card, 2/2 for 1. There's a lot of powerful 1-cost Warlock cards, but this also can select from neutral minions. So this is a strong value card, but given that Warlock is a class that doesn't really necessarily struggle with value, it's less exciting to me. Cards that give you incremental value in Warlock are less exciting than they are in a lot of other classes, I think. Just because you are less sort of starved for cards as resources compared to them. But there are a lot of just like good 1-cost cards, and being able to find 1-cost cards that you can like slot into your curve at some point during the game, it's in many cases going to be stronger than discover a 2-cost card. The 2-cost card has a higher impact, but is less able to be fit into your curve, and makes it more difficult to sort of create a game plan around it. But anyway, I think that this is a card that's certainly interesting, and I imagine will certainly people will experiment with because hey, value, but not really anything that looks to define any kind of deck type at least. All right, Curse of Rapham. Give your opponent a cursed card while they hold it. They do 2 damage in their turn. My understanding is that the cursed card is just a spell that costs 2 mana. So if your opponent, this is basically your opponent takes 2 damage until they spend the 2 mana to get rid of this, which is actually pretty cool. As to whether like spending 2 mana of your own to do 2 damage to your opponent, and potentially more than that if they don't pay it off, is better than just playing a minion. Hard to really evaluate this. I like the concept of this card because it's actually one of the things that's really cool about it. This like always beats Ice Block. If your opponent has Ice Block up, you can curse them, get them down to 1, and then just kill them with this because it triggers in their own turn. That's an interesting thing if you're playing a deck that's like potentially struggling with Freeze Mage. It's like, yeah, you just played this in your deck and you just kill them. It obviously has synergy with Loatheb, but it's not really what you're looking to do when you Loatheb them, I think, either. But no, I like that a card like this exists. I don't know that it will necessarily find play outside of sort of hating on Freeze Mages or whatever, or hating on Ice Block in particular. But I mean, it could just be a relatively efficient way to do damage if you are putting pressure on your opponent and forcing them to use their mana to react to you to begin with. So that if they do use their mana to get rid of the curse card, they're stumbling a little bit. The fact that you're doing this instead of playing a minion, generally speaking, or instead of playing as strong a minion as you could, makes it a little bit less attractive to me. But yeah, I don't know. It's interesting, and I certainly think it's a cool card. Reliquaryseeker. 1 cost 1/1. If you have 6 other minions, gain +4/+4. I think it's difficult to make cheap Warlock cards because of life tap. So here's one. Definitely is works well with Implosion, Imp Gang Boss, whatever else. Being able to play any kind of undercosted minion is pretty exciting. I can't really ever see playing this before I'm already playing 2 Sea Giants, but I like the idea of the card. I just don't expect it to really find a home. Right, Obsidian Destroyer. It's a 7/7 for 7 at the end of your turn. Summon a 1/1 Scarab with Taunt. It is hard for me to imagine a world in which this sees constructed play. It's more resilient than Hogger to mass removal effects, which is powerful when you're able to generate additional stuff. The fact that it dies to Big Game Hunter, kind of sad. The fact that it lines up, pretty poorly against something like Dr. Boom because you get a 7/7 and 1/1/1. They get a 7/7 and 2/1/1s with more abilities. But it is a powerful card in Arena, and that's actually something that's very relevant, especially for Warriors. It's a common card that's a very high impact late game card, which is something that Warrior decks need in Arena. So it's important. I've talked about a lot of these cards in various contexts, but this is one that it's important to recognize. Even if it's a card that never sees constructed play, it has a relevant home in sort of the ecosystem of Hearthstone in general, simply because it plays a role in this particular format. Fierce Monkey. Similarly, this is a great card in Arena. A 3/4 taunt for 3, very very powerful. I actually think it's a totally reasonable stat line for constructed too. It's 1 less health than a Sen'jin Shieldmaster for 1 less mana. The 1 less health matters a lot. It does line up poorly against True Silver, against Shredder or Swipe or whatever else, but it's also just cheaper. So the fact that you can get it down early on and defend yourself with minions is something that a lot of Warrior decks have often just not really been able to do. Most Warrior decks are built around using weapons early in the game and then transitioning to late game minions, but being able to have substantial minions early on is pretty strong. It also works potentially very well with Bolster. One of the problems with a lot of the Bolster decks is that a lot of the cheap taunt minions just aren't very good, and this is a very very strong one that you can bolster up pretty effectively. So I like it. I think it will see play in. Certainly in Arena, and I would not be surprised to see it play in Constructed as well. Cursed Blade. This is a cool card. Basically a cheaper War Axe that is worse at keeping you alive. War Axe mostly uses removal, but this is a kind of a scary card to just start attacking your opponent's minions with. It is potentially quite strong in an aggressive Warrior deck. It's effectively 6 damage for 1 mana. That you can play as soon as turn 1, and there's not that many attractive options for Warrior decks to play on turn 1. So if you just start going and attacking right away, it's kind of sweet. Certainly not going to see play in control Warrior style decks whatsoever. The fact that it is using your life total even more as a resource when Warrior is a deck that does that to begin with is pretty scary. But I like the card.
You require my assistance?
So this I think maybe duplicate, so now we can polymorph his guy. Duplicate his sheeps.